Hello everyone and welcome to this Gidea Park study day. Amid the multiple tragedies of COVID-19, I think we're beginning to realize that there are also huge opportunities. There's an added incentive to try to do something about creation, about caring and protecting the good world that God has given to us. And there's also the challenge, clearer now than ever before, to foster solidarity. And these two themes particularly have emerged as the focus of the papal teaching of Pope Francis, through his encyclicals, through his homilies, through his speeches, through his visits. We had the pleasure of welcoming Austen Ivereigh to a study day at the end of January, where he spoke about the book Let Us Dream. And today he's agreed to come back again and to focus on what is called the culture of encounter. Now, that's a phrase which is actually there in the writings of Pope Francis, the culture of encounter. And it seems to me that's about people coming together, getting to know each other, getting to respect each other beyond all the differences. And when we hear the news, when we look at what's going on in the world today, we realize how urgent this is. The specific question that Austen's going to address is, can Pope Francis' vision of fraternity counter the politicization of faith? Quite a question. So I'm delighted, Austen, once more that you're here for us and you're going to give us, I'm sure, a most interesting day. Austen is, of course, for those who don't know, a biographer of Pope Francis with his two works, The Great Reformer and The Wounded Shepherd. So Austen, I will hand over to you, welcome you, and thank you so much. We look forward very much to listening to the culture of encounter. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Adrian. It's great to be back at Gidea Park virtually, and great that you could all come this morning. I know it's a wet and cold day, which always makes it easier to accept these Zoom invitations. So I'm going to dig into this key idea of Francis's, the one that's been present from the beginning of his pontificate, and as I'll explain, goes back some way back into his life. This concept of the culture of encounter, cultura del encuentro in Spanish. It's a phrase that he first used in 1999, but as I'll explain, the origins of it really go back to his childhood. Now I'm going to do this talk in two parts, as you've just been told. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the origins of the idea, where it comes from, and really what it means, what it consists of, and how it developed over time in Aparecida, how it appears particularly in Evangelii Gaudium, his apostolic exhortation of 2013. And then I'm going to move into the great visit to Abu Dhabi in February 2019 and the human fraternity document, which of course is then quoted in extenso in Fratelli Tutti, and then March this year, the visit to Iraq. So I might not get to all of that in the first part, but what I wanted to do was to outline the concept and then show how he's applying it at the moment in a way to forestall, as you heard Father Adrian say, to forestall the unhealthy, if you like, dynamic in which religion is being exploited both by extremists and by populists. And to counter that, Francis is seeking to create a culture of encounter, which is what enables fraternity. And so that's the big sort of strategic idea that I want to explain in the first part. And in the second part, I want to dig in quite deeply into chapter 2 and 3 of Fratelli Tutti, his encyclical of October last year. And particularly what I think is the idea at the heart of it, which is the shift of consciousness, which is enabled by, or told by, or performed by, the theologians would say, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then I want to end then with talking about synodality, and particularly in livestream, and how Francis understands that even with difference and contrast and tension, we can create something new out of that with the help of the Holy Spirit, if we have certain attitudes, which of course are very much linked to attitudes of faith. So that's a map of the two talks, but I'll probably go all over the place in my usual way. But that's to give you a little map at the beginning. So as I say, the concept was first coined. He first used the phrase "la cultura del encuentro" in 1999. So he became Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998. So it was just shortly after that. And he gave his first, what was called Te Deum, in Buenos Aires Cathedral. I'm just having a quick look at the time to make sure I'm going to speak for 40 minutes. Te Deum in Buenos Aires Cathedral, which is when you sort of have in Argentina an annual meeting effectively with the political leaders, the political class of the country. And when the Archbishop of Buenos Aires would traditionally give a great sort of encomium to the nation. Well, Cardinal Bergoglio used to use this as a moment really to challenge the political class. And what concerns him in that very first Te Deum that he gives is the fragmentation of Argentine society, the way people are descending in a way which we would very much recognize now as being true of the whole of Western society. People were retreating into walls of identity, withdrawing from each other into a sort of tribalism, in which I have my truth, you have your truth, I have my identity, you have yours. And everything becomes then a source of conflict and effectively a power play. Who can win? Who will win out? And he's seen this happening in Argentina. I mean, he's often said that Argentina's the kind of great besetting sin of Argentina is the history of desencuentro. And that is a great thing in Spanish, is that you've got this word encounter, encuentro, and you've also got the opposite in Spanish, desencuentro, which you can't do in English. You can't say disencounter. But it's actually a very powerful word, because people will often say in Argentina, talking about a meeting with somebody, it was a disencounter. I think we would say in English, we were like ships passing in the night. And I thought actually it's an interesting kind of almost way to begin to say, well, before we talk about what an encounter is, let's just try and imagine what a disencounter is. And I'm sure you're familiar with it. If you've ever been with somebody, or you've had a meeting with somebody, or you met somebody at a party, and it's almost as if they're looking straight past you, beyond you. They're not interested in you, or it's a purely transactional encounter in which you have to agree something, and that's it. There's no space made for each other. There's no time made for each other. There's no growth. There's no growth in understanding. Neither, as it were, reaches out to the other. Neither creates space for the other. There's no growth that takes place. So that's a desencuentro, which really helps us to understand what an encuentro is, what an encounter is, which is really the opposite of that. It is the going out to the other. There's an element there of giving up something, and of taking on something, of entering into another's space. And that requires patience, it requires time, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to dig a bit more into this idea of encounter in some of his writings and teachings. But just for you to understand at the beginning, you have this concept of encounter, which I'll go into in a minute. And then the culture of encounter is the application of this principle at the level of society or culture, or the level of a nation, or indeed the level of the globe, as he would now be concerned with as Pope. So we have the personal encounter, and then we have the culture of encounter, which is, if you like, is what facilitates encounter at a deeper or wider level. So the origin of this, of his, I suppose, interest in or passion for this topic goes back to his childhood. When I was doing my second book on Francis Wounded Shepherd, I was fascinated by a letter which was sort of discovered, or read out rather, in 2014 by a Brazilian priest, who later, by the way, became an official in the Vatican, but that doesn't really matter. His name is Father Alexandre Aui. And Aui acted as Bergoglio's sort of guide and interpreter in Rio de Janeiro in that first visit he made as Pope to Rio. And he had known Aui from before. Anyway, the two of them had developed a friendship. And Francis wrote him a very touching letter about his childhood, which Aui made public. I remember asking Aui about it, and he said, I just mentioned it, I never expected it to end up on a YouTube video, because it was actually a very personal letter. But what it revealed, and as his biographer, I found this fascinating, because I had this image, which was true, of Bergoglio being brought up in actually a very happy, stable, very loving family, but actually that was true of his parents and his paternal grandparents. But on his mother's side, it was actually very different. And they used to go and visit these Italian. It was a very Italian family, but the mother's side of the family was Genoese, and apparently, I don't know Italy, however, Genoese are famous for their hot tempers. And the Bergoglio family used to go and visit the mother's family, and there'd be these spectacular rows, where people throwing plates, and you can imagine the scene, a sort of violent Italian rows. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio was he was a very sensitive, very big-hearted child who I think had only known warmth and protection. He was deeply traumatized by this. And he spoke in this letter of the impact that it had on him, and how he wanted to just go away and hide. He was really terrified by all of this. And he said in the letter to Aui, he said, I think this could be the origin of my interest in the culture of encounter. And what he meant by that was, in other words, how can we not just avoid arguments? That's far too superficial an idea. The idea of the culture of encounter is how we can depolarize, how we can take tensions and depolarize them and allow then something to live with the tension and disagreement in such a way that we find a more fruitful way to live together. Indeed, we transcend not just our differences, but we are able to go on to a new way of thinking. And this is the way that differences can be contained and made fruitful, is what he came to talk about as and this isn't his phrase, by the way, as a reconciled diversity. Now, culture of encounter in many ways is Francis's or Bergoglio's own reformulation of the theological idea of a reconciled diversity, where people retain what is important to them, what is true to them. There's no denial, there's no giving up of anything, but as it were, they choose not to cling to it, and they enter into a relationship with others, which then can produce something greater. Now, this became Francis Bergoglio's passion intellectually. He was, and when we get on to synodality, I'll come back to this, talk about his thesis, but he effectively did his doctoral thesis, as you know, if you've read my books, on Romano Guardini's understanding of contraposition and contrast. And so this was the sort of intellectual expression of this idea that I've just expressed about how we can hold together divisions and disagreements in such a way as to allow them to become fruitful. And I think all of this can be therefore rooted or traced back to that childhood family experience, as Francis put it in this letter to Father Aui, which created in my heart a desire for people not to fight to stay united, or if they do fight, to remain friends. As this idea has developed in his life, I think he himself has come to understand that the capacity for encounter is in many ways the key characteristic of the Christian, of the person of faith. Yes, that it begins, and here's the sort of theology of it, that it begins with a personal encounter with Jesus. Our faith has to begin, even if we've inherited it from childhood, or we've come at faith in an intellectual way or whatever. At some point, there has to be, for faith to be real, there has to be a personal encounter with Jesus, which must touch the heart, which must create a new space within us, which must, to some way, change our horizon. So we are talking here about a God of encounter. We are talking here about a God who makes himself known to us, or makes God's self known to us in encounter, in personal encounter, and not just an encounter sort of with me as an individual, but entering also into my space, my culture, my people. So we have a God of the incarnation who, to save the world, to show the world, to show humanity the dignity of their own, what it means to be created by God, the dignity that comes with that, actually becomes incarnate in a place, in a time, speaking a language. Jesus is fully a part of that Jewish culture of the time. So we're talking here about a very rich idea of encounter, not just flying in, saying hi, and going away again, but entering completely and utterly into that space, into that culture, and of course being willing to die for those people, which is what Jesus did. So our whole faith begins with the concept, with the understanding of encounter, and that this entering into our culture, our way of thinking, our mode of being, has this element of kenosis, to use a big theological word, that there's a renunciation involved. The famous St. Paul thing. He took on the condition of a slave. He did not cling to God, but took on the condition of a slave. There's a renunciation, and to some extent in all encounter there has to be an element of renunciation. We must choose to renounce something, whether it's our pride or our desire to flee, or our horror of listening to other people's pain, or whatever it is. There's an element of kenosis, and to use another Greek word of synktakabasis, of coming down to come close. Now that's obviously what God performs. God performs this action of coming down in order to come close. But the closeness is absolutely key. There can be no encounter without proximity. And therefore for the church, and this is why this is such an important idea for Francis's whole pontificate, is that the church, we as Christians, the church as a whole, we have to be close. We have to learn how to make ourselves close, to make ourselves neighbors to others, in order to communicate the nature of God. Now, the key, and Francis says somewhere, I forget where, sorry, Jesus never proselytized. Jesus did not proselytize. He accompanied. Jesus made known God by walking with people, by getting to know them, by entering into dialogue with them, by responding to them in freedom and in their freedom. Now, the key to all of this is proximity, but then the other key is dialogue. So that dialogue is what enables encounter. Dialogue is not just speaking, of course. Dialogue is entering into communication with, and of course a very large part of dialogue is the capacity to listen. Listening as a key element of dialogue. And indeed one might say, and this is relevant now with Israel and Palestinians, going hell to leather at each other again at the moment. What is war? What is war except the absence of dialogue? The absence of dialogue, of course, doesn't necessarily produce war, but it produces the conditions for war. And war is very definitely the absence of dialogue. Now, in the meeting of Aparecida in Brazil in May 2007, which is when the Latin American bishops gathered together for a historic meeting, which I've often talked about in my books as the basis in many ways of this pontificate, the concept of encounter becomes absolutely key. So the Latin American bishops get together and they kind of analyze modernity, and they ask themselves some very big questions, like why is it the church has such difficulty in evangelizing the contemporary world? And they come up with not just simply a sociological analysis, but a kind of an understanding of what they call the change of era. The way technology and the digital era is changing the way we live, is undermining our institutions, producing this society which has been famously called a liquid society of transition and so on. All of which, of course, makes encounter much harder, but conversely produces in contemporary humanity a yearning for, or a thirst for, to use the language of the document, encounter. So we have this paradox that we live in an age of disencounter, of fragmentation, of dissolution of the bonds of belonging, where it is harder to have bonds of trust and belonging, where faith is no longer transmitted through those bonds of community and culture and law. Of course it is to some extent, but to a far lesser extent than it was. And we have this hunger, which you see particularly among the young, but really among everybody today, the yearning to belong, to have that encounter. So this was the great analysis of Aparecida. And what Aparecida really keeps talking about many times is what they call the primary encounter, el encuentro founding encounter, encuentro fundante, which is the kind of the amazement of the disciples in meeting Jesus, the exceptional quality of the one who was speaking to them, how he treated them. I'm quoting here from the document, satisfying the hunger and thirst for life that was in their hearts. So Aparecida says that we can no longer rely on Catholic institutions and culture to transmit the faith. We have to, as it were, go back, if it is a going back, or to recover the original Christian way of proclamation, which was people who had had that encounter with Christ went out to proclaim it and talk about it and put it into practice. And they didn't have the support of big institutions or law and culture. We're talking here about, of course, the first centuries of the church, when indeed there was persecution. And yet they were able to communicate the amazement of that encounter with Christ to people, and not just in words, but also in actions, which again, people found captivating or scandalous, whoever you were. But you certainly couldn't ignore the Christians, because they had this story to tell. So this is really, in a sense, what Aparecida is inviting the church to recover that, if it is to become again a missionary evangelizing force in the world, because part of its diagnosis of the church is that the church, particularly in the rich north, has gone cold. It has become disenchanted. It has lost that capacity, that missionary capacity, because it's clinging to its institutions, because it's clinging to the past or whatever. So the invitation is to come to enable the encounter with Christ. This is what they call in Aparecida the encuentro fundante. And Aparecida spells out all the different ways that this can happen, through the sacraments, through liturgies, through prayer, through contemplation of scripture, and so on. But it also talks very much about the encounter outside, this going out to encounter Christ in the poor, in the margins. Francis describes this, of course, in Evangelii Gaudium as the popular going out to meet Christ in the people. This spontaneous missionary activity, as he calls it, of the people of God. But so this is the big idea, the big concept of Aparecida, which is the faith encounter with the person of Jesus. It sounds very simple, almost banal, and yet actually it involves quite a big shift in the church's own thinking. And I can, by the way, anecdotally, Aparecida was a Pentecost experience, the Latin American church. They went into it feeling really quite depressed and down about, secularization and the spread of evangelicals and breakup of families, all the usual stuff. And they came away 2 weeks later really fired up by this vision, by this understanding, which they saw very much as a fruit of the Spirit. And it's this vision that underpins the whole Francis pontificate, and I believe will also underpin future pontificates. Aparecida is the most compelling vision of anywhere of the church at the moment. Now, if we look at Evangelii Gaudium, which is really the re-expression of Aparecida for the universal church by Pope Francis, it's his, if you like, foundational document, and we have encounter again mentioned something like 34 times in the document. Many, of course, right at the start, the very first line of Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. And just in those first few paragraphs, paragraph 3, I invite all Christians everywhere at this very moment to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ, or at least an openness to letting him encounter them. In other words, go out to meet Christ, and if you can't do that, open your heart to allow him to come to you. And to do it each day. And he quotes, Francis quotes in Evangelii Gaudium, as he had done also, by the way, in Aparecida, quotes Benedict XVI, which he says, this phrase takes us to the heart of the gospel. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. So the Christian faith is born from this encounter which changes our horizon. Paragraph 75, interesting contrast Francis draws between talking about the way we live now, that in our cities and so on, the degradation of our environment, so that what could be significant places of encounter and solidarity often become places of isolation and mutual distrust. So you were setting up here an interesting opposition, aren't we, between encounter and solidarity, fraternity, if you like, and isolation, mutual distrust. And above all, I would direct you to paragraphs 87 and 88, where we have, again, this very typical of Aparecida analysis of how we have networks and media and the social media and so on, which have enabled us to have contact, but often not fraternity. So there's a chaos in all of this, which they see as the potential to be converted into networks of fraternity. So this is a great challenge of the modern age, that we have a greater contact with each other through social media, and yet we have less fraternity. That paradox, if you like, is what needs to be converted. To use the actual phrase of Evangelii Gaudium, greater possibilities for communication thus turn into greater possibilities for encounter and solidarity for everyone. But how do we do that? How do we learn to do that is the great challenge of the culture of encounter. Paragraph 171 talks, as I've already mentioned, about the art of listening, which is absolutely key to the culture of encounter. Listening in communication is an openness of the heart which makes possible that closeness without which genuine spiritual encounter cannot occur. Very important phrase, that. Yeah? We cannot have encounter unless we open our heart, and listening is what opens the heart. By listening with an open heart is how we enable the dialogue to take place. Only through such respectful and compassionate listening can we enter our paths of true growth and awaken a yearning for the Christian ideal, the desire to respond fully to God's love and to bring to fruition what he has sown in our lives. And the other paragraph to draw attention to is paragraph 220, which is part of that section in Evangelii Gaudium about building a people. So paragraph 220, people in every nation enhance the social dimension of their lives by acting as committed and responsible citizens, not as a mob swayed by the powers that be. And then he goes on to talk about, yet becoming a people demands something more. It is an ongoing process in which every new generation must take part, a slow and arduous effort, calling for a desire for integration and a willingness to achieve this through the growth of a peaceful and multifaceted culture of encounter. So this is the expression for the Universal Church of what really he was working on as Archbishop of Buenos Aires in helping Argentina in those Te Deums every year to embrace a new kind of culture to overcome the desencuentro, the fragmentation, the disencounter, which so characterized particularly the politics and the society of that country, but which of course is very much part of what we are all living with. So as Pope, he has really been teaching that paragraph 220 in his apostolic visits. So he often in his apostolic visits, particularly to Latin America, has meetings with civic leaders. And you will usually find in those meetings on his apostolic trips, when he's talking, by the way, not just to believers, but you might be talking to anybody, civic leaders in general, trade unionists or mayors, but he gathers them in a room and he talks to them about the polyhedron, about the reconciled diversity, about the culture of encounter, and he sort of gives them tips and techniques about that. So there's a lot to unpack in those speeches about that, but that is the key idea. And what he is doing as Pope is very interesting, is he's modeling for the rest of the church the role of us as Christians as to use a Latin phrase, a complexio oppositorum, a reconciler of opposites, a carrier of tensions. Key idea for Francis. This is actually what Christ does, what God does. It enters the world and takes the difference, the tension, and turns it into something new. So this is the role of a very important role. So we talk about the Pope as Pontifex Maximus, the great builder of bridges. Building bridges is a holy act. Reconciliation, build bridges between people to enable encounter so that something new can be born, is a key task of the Church, of the Pope, and indeed of all of us as missionary disciples of Christ. So now let's go to the fraternity document. So the fraternity document, or the document on human fraternity, which was signed in February 2019 by Pope Francis and Sheikh Al-Tayeb, who's a kind of, I suppose, the chief jurist of the Sunni Muslim world. And they signed this document in Abu Dhabi, and they had a big meeting with interreligious meeting. It was a key moment in this pontificate and in this bridge building exercise, which was actually long prepared. And I knew at the time, I was told that it had been something like 2 years in the preparation, but I really didn't know too much about it. But just recently, there's been a book published, which is mentioned, if you're interested, there's an article about the book by Jerry O'Connell, at American Magazine. And it's really a very interesting article. And in that book, which is a book by, so I'm just looking for it now. I had it up here on the screen, just lost it. Yes, here it is. Just let me find it for a moment. Just a moment. So look, yeah. So yes, the article is called, if you're interested, An Inside Look at How Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar Have Revolutionized Catholic-Muslim Relations, rather long title. It was published on April the 13th, 2021. Anyway, this book, which is called The Pope and the Grand Imam, A Thorny Path, written in fact by the counselor to Al-Tayeb, very interesting account, how this came about. And without giving a whole history of it, what you see is there's this contact between this, he's not the Pope, but he's the major religious figure of the Sunni Muslim world, who sees Pope Francis, sees what he's doing, his outreach to migrants, but particularly the way Francis, remember, this is back in 2015, 2016, when we had all those jihadist attacks, and Francis always refuses to equate Islam and terrorism. He says Islam and terrorism are two different things here. We all have our fundamentalists and our extremists, though. That's not real Islam. Deeply impressed Sheikh Al-Tayeb. Anyway, there's this sort of various, they're reaching out to each other, and then there's a meeting between them finally, and then another meeting in 2017 where they had lunch, and they sort of just agreed they said, we need to work together for humanity and peace. And apparently the Pope picked up a piece of bread and cut it into two halves. He took one half himself and gave the other half to the Grand Imam, and each of them, ate his share of the bread in what this council describes as a symbolic act of coexistence and human fraternity. It's a nice little touch. Kind of Eucharistic as well, right? I mean, a great anecdote. Anyway, during that 2.5-hour lunch, the judge proposes, this is the councillor, that the Pope and the Grand Imam effectively build on the success of their early initiatives with this document on human fraternity, that they would both sign it and they would present it. And anyway, that's where the idea was born. 2017, took about 2 years. 2019, we had this document launched called the Document on Human Fraternity. And if you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It's actually a document which is not, it's far more than just a set of banal, propositions of lowest common denominators. It's really quite a radical document. I think it's very challenging for both sides. It's called the Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. And it begins in the name of God, who has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and who has called them to live together as brothers and sisters, to fill the earth and to make known the values of goodness and love and peace and so on. So it's starting with this very bold proclamation of faith in God. They don't get into the theological differences, but they say, God has forbidden to kill. They say, God asks us to live together as brothers and sisters. they call upon everybody to rediscover the values of peace, of justice, of goodness, of beauty, of human fraternity, and so on. Effectively, what they do is they not only just affirm those things, but they together condemn the instrumentalization of religion by both fanatics and by populists. And just to briefly explain this, Francis, it's clear from my reading of a lot of his speeches back in particularly 2018, 2019, you can see that Francis is deeply concerned by the emergence across the Western world of the forces of populism, which are often coming to power or gaining popularity by scapegoating Muslims. This, I mean, in the Christian West, you know, whether it's raising the walls to keep out immigration, or whether it's laws to deny people citizenship and so on. There's these crowd-pleasing initiatives by populists who are clearly putting the blame for contemporary ills on this kind of foreign element, on Muslims, and promising, in a sense, to build a wall. I mean, in Trump's case, literally to build a wall around them to protect them from this, and to shun the foreigners on. And by the way, quite understandable as a political move, given that people are deeply traumatized by the jihadi attacks that, as we know, went right into our cities and killed huge numbers of our people, of our citizens. And so quite understandable that there should be this fear. But the populists play on this, and they want to scapegoat the whole of Islam. And so what Francis and Al-Tayeb are doing here is they're condemning both of those things. They're condemning the extremism which practices violence in the name of God. And also they condemn the populism which pretends to be protecting religion by scapegoating or blaming or opposing the other religion. So it's this cycle, this dynamic, that they're seeking to break through, or break out of, I should say, in this, by standing together and saying, here we are, Pope, Grand Imam, this is what we believe. And by the way, this thing over here is not religion. This is not us. This is not Islam. This is not Christianity. That is a false god. That is an ideology. So that's the strategy. And of course, it involved a lot of thinking also about how each faith could affirm the other or affirm the other's needs. So we have, for example, Al-Tayeb, saying that Christians have a right, to freedom of worship, which is quite a big deal in the Arab world to say that. And in fact, they had the first mass ever on the Arabian Peninsula in Abu Dhabi. The Pope celebrated mass there first time. So there's clearly some gain, and equally, the Pope is affirming the need to welcome migrants, to respect them, to respect their differences, and so on. But I think so that's the strategy behind the document. But I think the lasting impact of it is in its call on all people of faith to work together, to create a society of fraternities. There's a very important idea that because we have different faiths, that somehow we can't work together. Francis and Al-Tayeb are saying, no. Look at all that we believed. Look at the faith that we have. Look at the God we believe in. We need to work together. So it lays out the basis for a civic movement inspired by faith that can help to build a culture of encounter, a culture of fraternity in our world. And then, of course, the coda to this is the visit to Iraq, which Pope Francis made in March, where he met the leader. Again, none of these are official, but the sort of acknowledged leader of the Shiite Islam, Shiite Muslims, al-Sistani, and it was a remarkable meeting, which again took many months of preparation. The al-Sistani, a 90-year-old cleric revered across the Shiite world, they had this lovely meeting, and afterwards had a message which, Sistani affirmed his concern that Christian citizens should live like all Iraqis in peace and security with full constitutional rights. In other words, a complete rejection of the extremists. Francis thanks Sistani for raising his voice in defense of the weakest and the most persecuted. So again, they're affirming together the vitality and the importance of fraternity. After meeting al-Sistani, the Pope then goes to attend a gathering in Ur, which is the famous Ur, the birthplace of Abraham. Abraham, of course, the prophet revered by all three monotheisms. And so, again, very symbolic meeting, 6,000-year-old ziggurat, you know, in the plains of Ur, traditional birthplace of Abraham. And there, the various religious leaders, although sadly missing Jews, gathered together and issued a very important statement. And Francis, again, does an address there, which is really a summary of the culture of encounter. So to try and answer Father Adrian's question, is this all capable of breaking that link between, on the one hand, that sort of diabolic mutual dependence of, on the one hand, religious extremism, Islamic extremism, on the other hand, national populism? Short answer is I don't know, but because history is very hard to predict. But I think it's been one of the most significant and courageous acts by religious leaders, really for certainly in my lifetime, and perhaps in many, many hundreds of years. And the effect of it, I think, will be with us for a long time.